I once wore silk that whispered against marble floors, and now I wear rags that scratch against my skin like a punishment I never earned. But the cruelest part of falling from grace is not the hunger or the cold. It is the silence of a world that once called you daughter, friend, beloved. My name, the one I was born with, the one my mother breathed into my ear as she lay dying, was Eleanor Catherine Ashford. I was the only child of Lord Henry Ashford, a man whose kindness was as vast as his fortune, and whose only fault was trusting the wrong woman with his heart. After my mother passed, when I was barely 18, my father remarried. Lady Beatrice came into our home like a slow poison, graceful, charming, and patient. She waited 3 years before she struck, and when she did, she made certain there would be nothing left of me to salvage. I remember the night my father died as though it were etched in glass behind my eyes. The physician said it was his heart, that he had gone peacefully in his sleep. But I saw the empty vial in the wastebasket of his study, the one Beatrice's maid had forgotten to remove. I said nothing because I had no proof, only the cold certainty in my bones that the woman who smiled at his funeral had put him in the ground. Within a fortnight, the solicitors arrived. They brought documents I had never seen, letters I had never written, and witnesses I had never met. They said I had signed away my inheritance before my father's death, that I had agreed to a modest annual sum in exchange for my freedom to marry a man of low birth. They said I had eloped in secret and returned only when my so-called husband abandoned me. They said I was disgraced, disinherited, and unwelcome in the house where I had taken my first steps. I denied it all. I wept. I begged. I demanded to see the family solicitor who had known me since I was in the cradle. But Mr. Pemberton had died the month before, and his replacement was a young man with cold eyes who looked at me as though I were already a ghost. He said the documents were authentic. He said the witnesses were unimpeachable. He said Lady Beatrice had shown great restraint in not pursuing charges of fraud against me for attempting to reclaim an inheritance I had legally forfeited. I was removed from Ashford Hall with nothing but the clothes on my back and the contents of my mother's vanity box, which a kind housemaid had hidden in my traveling case. Inside that box was her pearl comb, a lock of her hair, a letter she had written me on the day I was born, and the locket. The locket was heavy gold, encrusted with diamonds and sapphires, and inside it was a miniature portrait of my mother and the Ashford crest engraved with our family motto. That locket was worth more than most estates in England, and it was the only proof I had left of who I truly was. I tried, in those first terrible months, to find help. I went to my father's friends, but their doors were closed to me. I went to distant relatives, but they had already heard the rumors Beatrice had spread. I went to the church, to the magistrate, to anyone who might listen. But a woman alone, without money, without connections, without a man to speak for her, is nothing in this world, less than nothing. I was turned away, again and again, until the winter came and I had nowhere left to go. The workhouse at Whitmore accepted me on a January night so cold that I could not feel my fingers. I gave them a false name, Mary Brown, because I knew that if Beatrice discovered I was still alive and still in possession of the locket, she would find a way to take it from me. I hid it beneath my clothes, against my skin, where it lay like a second heartbeat, and I learned, very quickly, how to disappear. The workhouse was a place designed to break the spirit. We woke before dawn and worked until our hands bled. We ate gruel that tasted of nothing and slept in rooms so crowded that the air itself seemed to suffocate. The other women were kind in their way, but kindness in that place was a luxury no one could afford for long. We learned not to ask questions. We learned not to remember who we had been. We learned that survival was a matter of becoming invisible, of shrinking so small that the world forgot to crush us. I had been there for nearly 4 years when the Duke of Westerfield came. I did not know at first who he was. I only knew that the matron was in a frenzy, ordering us to scrub floors that were already clean and to hide the women who were too sick or too mad to be seen by polite society. I was assigned to the laundry that day, which meant I was meant to be invisible, tucked away in the steam and the soap where no gentleman would wander. But the gentleman wandered. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, measured, deliberate, the sound of a man who had never been denied entry to any room in his life. I kept my head down, my hands in the scalding water, my shoulders curved inward like a question mark. I had perfected the posture of insignificance. I had learned that men like him looked through women like me, not at us. And yet he stopped. I felt his gaze before I met it. There is a weight to being truly seen, a pressure that is almost physical. I had not felt it in years. I had forgotten what it was like to exist in someone else's eyes. My hands stilled in the water, my breath caught in my throat. And then, against every instinct I had cultivated, I looked up. He was tall, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples, and a face that might have been carved from marble. His eyes were gray, the color of winter storms, and they held no warmth. He wore black, as though he were in mourning, and his expression was one of such profound detachment that I thought for a moment he must be a statue come to life. He looked at me the way one might look at a puzzle, with a faint frown of concentration, as though I were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be pitied. I should have looked away. I should have returned to my work, to my invisibility, to the safety of being no one. But something in his gaze held me, something in the way he stood there, unmoving, as though he had all the time in the world to study me. I felt, for the first time in years, a flicker of something I had thought long dead. It was not hope, not exactly. It was recognition. As though he saw beneath the grime and the rags and the exhaustion the ghost of the woman I had been. And then his eyes dropped to my chest. I felt a spike of panic so sharp it was almost pain. My hand flew to my collar, to the place where the chain of the locket rested against my skin. I had been careless. The fabric of my dress had shifted in the heat of the laundry, and the chain had slipped into view. Just a glint of gold, barely visible. But he had seen it. His frown deepened. He took a step closer, and I took a step back, my spine pressing against the edge of the washing basin. He said nothing. He simply looked at me, at the chain, at my face, as though he were cataloging details for later examination. I wanted to speak, to explain, to lie, but my voice had deserted me. I could only stand there, trembling, waiting for him to call the matron, to accuse me of theft, to take from me the only thing I had left. Instead, he turned away. He walked out of the laundry without a word, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The other women were staring at me, their faces pale with fear and curiosity. I shook my head, unable to explain, and returned to my work with shaking hands. That night I lay awake in my narrow cot, clutching the locket beneath my thin blanket. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself he had not truly seen, or that if he had dismissed it as a worthless trinket, a pitiful memento from a life I no longer lived. I told myself I was safe, that I was still invisible, that tomorrow would be the same as every day before it. But I knew, in the hollow of my chest, where my hope used to live, that something had changed. The Duke of Westerfield had looked at me. He had seen the locket. And men like him did not forget. I did not sleep that night. I watched the thin moonlight creep across the floor, counting the hours until dawn, waiting for the knock on the door that would end my fragile existence. But the knock did not come. Morning arrived, gray and cold, and I rose with the other women and went to my work as though nothing had happened. 3 days passed, then 4. I began to believe I had imagined the whole encounter, that the Duke had been a fever dream brought on by exhaustion and loneliness. I began to breathe again, to eat again, to sink back into the numbing routine that had kept me alive for so long. On the 5th day, The matron came for me. She was a hard woman, Mrs. Blackwood, with a face like a closed fist and eyes that had seen too much suffering to feel any of it anymore. She told me to follow her, and I did, my legs moving of their own accord while my mind raced through every possible explanation. Had someone reported me? Had Beatrice finally found me? Was I to be thrown out into the streets, or worse, handed over to the authorities for some crime I had not committed? The matron led me to a small office at the front of the workhouse, a room I had never entered before. She opened the door and gestured for me to go inside. And there, standing by the window with his back to me, was the Duke of Westerfield. He turned as I entered, and I saw that his expression had not changed. He was still cold, still distant, still looking at me as though I were a specimen under glass. But there was something else in his eyes now, something I could not name. It might have been curiosity. It might have been suspicion. It might have been something else entirely. The matron closed the door behind me, and I was alone with him. I stood very still, my hands clasped in front of me, my eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond his left shoulder. I did not know what to say. I did not know what he wanted. I only knew that my heart was beating so fast I was certain he could hear it, and that my carefully constructed invisibility had failed me at last. He studied me for a long moment, his gray eyes moving over my face, my hair, my hands. Then he spoke, and his voice was low and smooth, like velvet wrapped around steel. He said he had been thinking about me since his visit. He said there was something about me that did not fit, something in the way I held myself, in the way I had met his eyes, that suggested I was not what I appeared to be. He said he had seen the chain around my neck, and he wished to know what hung from it. I said nothing. I could not. My throat had closed around the words, trapping them inside me like birds in a cage. I knew that whatever I said next would determine my fate. If I lied and he believed me, I might survive. If I lied and he did not believe me, I would lose everything. And if I told the truth, if I showed him the locket and spoke my real name, I would be placing my life in the hands of a stranger. He waited. The silence stretched between us like a wire pulled taut. And then, without quite knowing why, I reached beneath my collar and drew out the locket. It caught the light from the window, glittering like a captured star. The Duke's eyes widened, just for a moment, before his mask of composure slipped back into place. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw. He asked if he might examine it, and I heard myself say yes. His fingers brushed mine as he took the locket from my hand. The touch was brief, impersonal, and yet I felt it like a brand. He opened the locket and looked at the portrait inside, at my mother's face, at the crest engraved on the opposite side. And when he looked up at me again, there was something new in his eyes. It was not warmth, not yet. But it was no longer suspicion. He said he knew this crest. He said he had known Lord Henry Ashford, had dined at his table, had respected him as a man of honor. He said he had heard the rumors about Lord Ashford's daughter, the one who had disgraced herself and disappeared. He said he had always wondered if the rumors were true. I met his gaze, and for the first time in 4 years, I spoke my own name. I told him I was Eleanor Catherine Ashford. I told him the rumors were lies. I told him I had been betrayed, robbed, cast out by a woman who had murdered my father and stolen my inheritance. I told him I had nothing left but this locket and the truth. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, turning the locket over in his hands. Then he closed it, and he placed it back in my palm, and he said something I had not expected. He said he believed me. I stared at him, unable to comprehend. I had spent 4 years being disbelieved, dismissed, ignored. I had told my story to magistrates and clergymen and distant cousins, and not one of them had believed me. And now this stranger, this cold and distant Duke, was looking at me with something that might have been respect, and telling me he believed every word. He said he could not explain why, not yet. He said there were things about his own past, his own losses, that made him more inclined to recognize the truth when he heard it. He said he wished to help me, if I would allow it. He said he had a position available at his estate, a respectable position that would provide me with shelter and safety while he looked into my claims. I should have refused. I should have been suspicious of his motives, wary of his kindness. Men of his station did not help women like me without expecting something in return. But I was tired. I was so very tired. And when he offered me his hand, I found that I could not refuse. I took it. His grip was firm and warm, and it steadied me in a way I had not been steadied in years. He told me his carriage would come for me at dawn. He told me to speak to no one about our conversation. He told me to trust him. And then he was gone, and I was left standing alone in that small, cold office, clutching my locket, wondering if I had just saved myself or damned myself entirely. That night, as I lay in my cot for the last time, I thought about my mother. I thought about the letter she had written me on the day I was born, the one I still carried in the hidden pocket of my dress. She had written that I was her greatest joy, her brightest hope. She had written that, no matter what darkness came, I must remember that I was loved, that I was worthy, that I was enough. I had forgotten those words for so long. But as I closed my eyes, I heard them again, as though she were whispering them into my ear. And for the first time in 4 years, I allowed myself to hope. The carriage came at dawn, just as he had promised. I climbed inside with nothing but the clothes on my back and the locket against my heart. The workhouse disappeared behind me, swallowed by the morning mist. And as the wheels began to turn, carrying me toward an unknown future, I realized that I was no longer invisible. The Duke of Westerfield had seen me, and whatever came next, I would never be invisible again. The journey to Westerfield Manor took the better part of a day, and I spent most of it watching the world change outside the carriage window. The grey streets of London gave way to muddy country roads, then to rolling hills dotted with sheep, then to forests so dense and green that I felt as though I were traveling backward through time. I had not seen such beauty in years. I had forgotten that it existed. The carriage was finer than any I had ridden in since my fall from grace. The seats were upholstered in deep blue velvet, and there was a fur blanket folded in the corner for warmth. A small basket had been left on the seat beside me, containing bread and cheese and apples and a flask of hot tea. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, remembering what it felt like to taste food that had been prepared with care. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I did not let them fall. I had cried enough in the workhouse. I would not cry now. The Duke did not accompany me. He had sent a letter with the coachman, explaining that he had business in London that would keep him for several days, but that I was to be received at the manor and given a position in the household. The letter was formal, almost cold, and yet there was something in the careful phrasing that suggested he had taken pains to ensure my comfort. He had instructed the housekeeper to prepare a private room for me, to provide me with suitable clothing, and to allow me time to rest before I began my duties. It was more kindness than I had received in 4 years, and I did not know what to make of it. I arrived at Westerfield Manor as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The manor itself was a vast stone edifice, older than I had expected, with ivy climbing its walls and tall windows that gleamed like watchful eyes. It sat at the end of a long drive lined with ancient oaks, their branches bare in the late winter chill. There was something melancholy about the place, something that spoke of grandeur faded and joy forgotten. And yet it was beautiful, in the way that old things are beautiful, worn smooth by time and memory. The housekeeper, Mrs. Thornton, met me at the door. She was a tall woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She looked me over with an expression I could not read, taking in my ragged clothes and tangled hair and the dirt beneath my fingernails. I braced myself for contempt, for dismissal, for the cold politeness that servants reserve for those they consider beneath them. But instead, She simply nodded and said she had been expecting me. She led me through the entrance hall, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors in suits of armor that stood like silent sentinels, up a winding staircase to a corridor lined with closed doors. My room was at the end of the hall, small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the gardens. There was a fire burning in the grate, and on the bed lay a simple gray dress and a clean white apron, neatly folded. Mrs. Thornton told me to wash and rest, that dinner would be brought to my room, and that I would begin my duties in the morning. She did not ask me questions. She did not comment on my appearance or my circumstances. She simply treated me as though I were any new servant arriving for the first time, and for that small mercy, I was grateful beyond words. I washed the grime of the workhouse from my skin and dressed in the clean clothes. They were plain but well made, and they fit me better than anything I had worn in years. I looked at myself in the small mirror above the washstand and saw a stranger looking back at me. My face was thinner than I remembered, my cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin. My hair, once my pride, hung limp and dull around my shoulders. But my eyes were the same, the deep green that my father had called forest eyes, and in them I saw something I had not seen in a long time. I saw myself. That night I ate the simple meal that was brought to me, roast chicken and potatoes and fresh bread, and I slept in a real bed for the first time in 4 years. I dreamed of my mother, of the garden at Ashford Hall, of her voice singing me to sleep. And when I woke, the sun was streaming through the window, and I felt, for the first time, that I might survive. The days that followed were filled with work, but it was work of a different kind than I had known in the workhouse. Mrs. Thornton assigned me to the library, where my duties consisted of dusting the shelves, organizing the books, and ensuring that the fires were kept burning. It was quiet work, solitary work, and I suspected it had been chosen deliberately to give me time to recover my strength. The library was vast, filled with thousands of volumes on every subject imaginable, and I found myself lingering over the spines, running my fingers over titles I had once read in another life. The other servants regarded me with curiosity, but not hostility. They had been told I was a distant relation of the Duke who had fallen on hard times, a fiction that explained my education and my manners without revealing the truth of my disgrace. I played my part carefully, speaking little, keeping my head down, trying to blend into the fabric of the household. But I could not help noticing the way they whispered when they thought I could not hear, speculating about who I really was and why the Duke had brought me here. The Duke himself remained in London for nearly a fortnight. I did not ask about him, and no one volunteered information. But I found myself thinking about him more than I should have, replaying our conversation in the workhouse office, trying to understand why he had helped me. Men of his station did not rescue women from workhouses out of pure kindness. They expected something in return. And yet he had asked nothing of me, had made no improper suggestions, had treated me with a respect I had not experienced since my father's death. It unsettled me. I did not know how to interpret kindness without condition, having lived so long in a world where everything had a price. On the 15th day, Mrs. Thornton informed me that the Duke had returned and wished to see me in his study. I felt a flutter of something in my chest, something I refused to name, and I smoothed my dress and checked my reflection before descending the stairs. The study was on the ground floor, a dark paneled room lined with books and hunting trophies, with a large desk positioned before a window that overlooked the grounds. The Duke was standing by the window when I entered, his back to me, his figure silhouetted against the gray afternoon light. He turned as I approached, and I saw that he looked tired. There were shadows beneath his eyes, and a tension in his jaw that had not been there before. He gestured for me to sit in the chair before his desk, and he remained standing, one hand resting on the window frame as though he needed its support. He asked if I had been comfortable, if the staff had treated me well, if there was anything I required. I answered each question carefully, aware that this was not the true purpose of our meeting. And when the pleasantries were exhausted, he fell silent, his gray eyes studying me with an intensity that made my breath catch. He said he had been making inquiries. He said he had visited the offices of the solicitor who had handled my father's estate and had examined the documents that had been used to disinherit me. He said he had spoken to witnesses, reviewed signatures, followed trails of evidence that had gone cold years ago, and he said he had discovered something troubling. I waited, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles ached. He walked to his desk and picked up a sheaf of papers, rifling through them as though searching for a specific page. Then he looked at me, and his expression was grave. He said the documents were forgeries. He said a handwriting expert had confirmed that the signatures purporting to be mine were inconsistent with authentic samples he had obtained. He said the witnesses who had testified against me had been paid, their stories rehearsed and coordinated. He said there was no doubt in his mind that Lady Beatrice had orchestrated the entire fraud. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt triumphant. But instead, I felt only a crushing weight of grief, as though I were losing my father all over again. I had known the truth, of course. I had lived with it for 4 years, but hearing it confirmed, hearing it spoken aloud by someone other than myself, made it real in a way it had not been before. I bowed my head and pressed my hand against my mouth, fighting against the sob that threatened to escape. The Duke said nothing. He simply waited, giving me time to compose myself, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of my emotions. When I finally looked up, I saw something unexpected in his eyes. It was not pity, which I would have hated. It was understanding. It was the recognition of one wounded soul by another. He said there was more. He said he had discovered that Lady Beatrice had not merely stolen my inheritance, but had also been systematically draining the Ashford accounts for years. She had sold off properties, dismissed loyal servants, allowed the estate to fall into disrepair. She had taken everything my father had built over a lifetime and squandered it on her own vanity and ambition. And she had done it all while wearing the mask of a grieving widow, playing the part of the wronged stepmother who had been abandoned by her ungrateful stepdaughter. I asked him why he was telling me this. I asked what he expected me to do with this information. I was still a woman without resources, without connections, without any means of challenging a woman who had the protection of society and the law. Even with proof of the forgeries, I could not afford to bring a case to court. I could not afford to fight her. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said something that changed everything. He said he would fight for me. I stared at him, certain I had misheard. He said he had resources that I did not, influence that I could not command. He said he had lawyers who could bring the case before the courts, investigators who could gather evidence, allies who could pressure Lady Beatrice into revealing the truth. He said he would use every tool at his disposal to restore my name, my inheritance, and my place in society. I asked him why. My voice was barely a whisper, but the question hung between us like a living thing. Why would a duke, a man who had everything, risk his reputation and his resources to help a woman he barely knew? What did he want from me? He was silent for a long time. He turned back to the window, his shoulders tense, his jaw tight. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, as though the words cost him something to say. He told me about his sister. Her name had been Charlotte, and she had been 5 years younger than him. She had been bright and beautiful and full of life, the joy of their family, the light of their home. And when she was 19, she had fallen in love with a man who had promised her everything and given her nothing. He had seduced her, abandoned her, and left her ruined in the eyes of society. Their father had disowned her in his rage, and their mother had been too weak to intervene. Charlotte had been cast out, just as I had been, left to fend for herself in a world that had no mercy for fallen women. She had died alone, in a boarding house in Bath, of a fever that might have been cured if she had had money for a proper physician. The Duke had been abroad when it happened, serving in the diplomatic corps. He had not even known she was ill until he received the letter informing him of her death. He had returned to England to find that his sister had been buried in an unmarked grave, that his father had forbidden any mention of her name, that she had been erased from the family as though she had never existed. He said he had carried that guilt for 15 years. He said he had wondered every day if he could have saved her if he had been there. He said he had built walls around his heart because it was easier than feeling the pain of her loss. And he said that when he saw me in the workhouse, when he recognized the same quiet dignity in my eyes that Charlotte had possessed, he knew he could not walk away. He was not helping me because he expected something in return. He was helping me because he could not save his sister, and saving me was the closest he could come to redemption. I did not know what to say. I sat there in silence, tears streaming down my face, overwhelmed by the weight of his confession. I had expected calculation, suspicion, hidden motives. I had not expected grief. I had not expected a wound that mirrored my own. When I finally found my voice, I told him about my mother. I told him about the letter she had written me, the one I still carried against my heart. I told him about the nights in the workhouse when I had read it by candlelight, when her words had been the only thing keeping me alive. I told him that I understood what it meant to lose someone you loved, to carry their memory like a stone in your chest, to wonder every day if you could have done something to save them. He listened without interrupting, his gray eyes fixed on mine. And when I finished, something shifted between us. It was not romance, not yet. It was something deeper, something more fragile. It was the recognition of two people who had walked through fire and survived. He said we would begin the legal proceedings immediately. He said I was to remain at Westerfield Manor, where I would be safe from Lady Beatrice's reach. He said I was no longer to work as a servant, but was to be treated as a guest, as a woman of standing, as the person I had always been beneath the rags and the dirt. I protested, weakly. I said I could not accept such generosity, that I had nothing to offer in return, that I was not worthy of his help. He cut me off with a look, and his voice, when he spoke, was firm but gentle. He said I was worthy. He said I had survived 4 years in hell without losing my dignity or my hope. He said I was the strongest woman he had ever met, and that if anyone deserved a second chance, it was me. I did not know how to respond to that. I had not thought of myself as strong. I had thought of myself as broken, as diminished, as a shadow of the woman I had once been. But when he looked at me, I saw something different in his eyes. I saw the woman I might become, if only I could find the courage to believe in her. That night, I was moved to a new room, a proper guest chamber with a canopied bed and silk curtains and a view of the gardens. A lady's maid was assigned to me, a young woman named Alice, who brushed my hair and helped me into a nightgown of fine linen and looked at me with something like awe in her eyes. I did not feel like a lady. I felt like an imposter, playing dress-up in someone else's life. But when I lay down in that soft bed, with the fire crackling in the grate and the moonlight streaming through the window, I allowed myself to imagine a different future. A future where my name was restored, where my inheritance was returned, where I could walk through the world with my head held high. A future where I was no longer invisible. And somewhere in the depths of that imagining, I saw the Duke's face, his gray eyes, his rare smile, the way he had looked at me when he spoke of his sister. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself he was simply a kind man performing a charitable act. I told myself I was foolish to feel anything for a man so far above my station. But the heart does not listen to reason. And as I drifted into sleep, I felt the first fragile stirrings of something I had thought lost forever. Something that felt, despite everything, like the beginning of love. The weeks that followed were like waking from a long and terrible dream. I ate proper meals and slept in a warm bed and wore clothes that did not scratch my skin. I walked through the gardens of Westerfield Manor, breathing air that smelled of earth and growing things instead of lie and despair. I read books from the library, reacquainting myself with the pleasures of literature that had sustained me in my youth. And slowly, so slowly I barely noticed it happening, I began to remember who I was. The Duke, whom I had learned to call Lord Westerfield in formal company, was a constant but distant presence. He took his meals in his study more often than not, and when we did dine together, our conversations were polite but guarded. He asked about my comfort, my health, my needs. He updated me on the progress of the legal case, which was moving forward with agonizing slowness. But he never spoke of personal matters, never referred again to the confession he had made about his sister, never gave any indication that our relationship was anything other than that of benefactor and beneficiary. I told myself I was grateful for his restraint. I told myself it was proper, appropriate, the way things should be between a duke and a woman of uncertain standing. But in the quiet hours of the night, when I lay awake listening to the wind in the trees outside my window, I found myself longing for something more. I wanted to know him, truly know him, the man behind the mask of aristocratic detachment. I wanted to understand why he had built such walls around his heart, and whether there was any chance they might someday fall. It was Mrs. Thornton who first told me about his past. She came to my room one afternoon to deliver fresh linens, and she lingered longer than necessary, folding and refolding the same towel as though searching for the courage to speak. I waited, sensing that she had something important to say, and finally she set down the towel and looked at me with eyes that held both warning and compassion. She said she had served the Westerfield family for 30 years. She had known the Duke since he was a boy, had watched him grow from a bright and laughing youth into the cold and guarded man he was today. She had seen him lose his sister, his parents, his faith in the goodness of the world. And she had watched him, 5 years ago, come within a breath of marriage to a woman who had nearly destroyed him. Her name was Lady Arabella Huntington, and she had been considered the most beautiful woman in London. She had pursued the Duke with a determination that bordered on obsession, and he, lonely and grieving and desperate for connection, had allowed himself to be caught. They had been engaged for 3 months when he discovered the truth. Lady Arabella had never loved him. She had loved his title, his fortune, his position in society. She had been conducting an affair with another man throughout their engagement, and she had intended to continue it after their marriage. When the Duke confronted her, she had laughed in his face and told him he should be grateful anyone was willing to marry him at all. The engagement had been broken quietly, to spare both families the scandal. Lady Arabella had married her lover, a minor baronet with gambling debts and a crumbling estate, and had spent the years since then spreading vicious rumors about the Duke. She claimed he had been cold, cruel, incapable of affection. She told anyone who would listen that she had escaped a terrible fate by ending their engagement, and society, always eager for gossip, had believed her. Mrs. Thornton said the Duke had not courted anyone since. He had retreated into himself, burying his heart so deep that no one could reach it. He attended social functions when required, played the part of the eligible bachelor, but he never allowed anyone close. He had convinced himself that love was a trap, that vulnerability was weakness, that the only way to survive was to feel nothing at all. I listened to this story with a heaviness in my chest that I could not explain. I understood now why he had been so reluctant to speak of personal matters. I understood why he kept such careful distance between us. He was not cold by nature. He was wounded, just as I was, and his detachment was a form of armor, a way of protecting himself from further pain. I thanked Mrs. Thornton for telling me, and she nodded, her expression unreadable. Before she left, she paused at the door and said something that stayed with me long after she was gone. She said the Duke had changed since I arrived. She said he smiled more often, spoke more freely, seemed lighter somehow. She said she had not seen him like this in years, and then she was gone, and I was left alone with my thoughts and my foolish, hopeful heart. The first sign of trouble came a fortnight later. I was in the library, reading by the fire, when the Duke entered with a letter in his hand and a darkness in his eyes that made my blood run cold. He said he had received word from his solicitor in London. Lady Beatrice had learned of the investigation. She knew that someone was gathering evidence against her, and she had begun taking steps to protect herself. She had hired her own lawyers, powerful men with connections to judges and politicians. She had begun spreading rumors that the Duke of Westerfield had gone mad, that he was obsessed with a woman from the workhouse, that he was being manipulated by a confidence trickster who had invented a tragic story to prey on his sympathies. She was painting me as a villain, a schemer, a woman who had seduced a grieving duke in order to steal his fortune. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had known Lady Beatrice was dangerous, had known she would not surrender her stolen wealth without a fight. But I had not anticipated this. I had not anticipated that she would attack the Duke himself, would risk her own reputation in order to destroy his. The Duke seemed to read my thoughts. He said he did not care about the rumors, that his reputation could withstand worse than the gossip of jealous aristocrats. He said Lady Beatrice was desperate, which meant she was afraid, which meant she knew her position was weaker than she pretended. He said the truth was on our side, and the truth would prevail. But I saw the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. I knew, even if he would not admit it, that the situation was more precarious than he wanted me to believe. Lady Beatrice was not just fighting to keep my inheritance. She was fighting to keep herself out of prison. And a cornered animal was the most dangerous kind. That night, I could not sleep. I paced my room, turning the problem over in my mind, searching for a solution I knew I could not find. I had nothing to offer, no resources, no allies, no power of my own. I was entirely dependent on the Duke's generosity, and now that generosity was putting him at risk. If the rumors spread, if society turned against him, he could lose everything: his reputation, his standing, his chance of ever finding happiness, and it would be my fault. I made a decision then, in the dark hours before dawn. I would leave. I would disappear, just as I had disappeared before, and I would find some other way to fight Lady Beatrice. I would not allow the Duke to sacrifice himself for me. I would not be the cause of another good person's destruction. I waited until the household was asleep, then gathered my few belongings and crept down the stairs. The front door was locked, but I knew there was a servant's entrance at the back of the house that was often left unlatched. I made my way through the darkened corridors, my heart pounding so loud I was certain it would wake the entire manor. I had just reached the back passage when a voice stopped me cold. He asked where I thought I was going. I turned to find the Duke standing in the shadows, still fully dressed, as though he had been waiting for me. His gray eyes gleamed in the darkness, and his expression was one I had never seen before. It was not anger, exactly. It was something deeper, something rawer. It was hurt. I tried to explain. I told him about the rumors, about my fear for his reputation, about my determination not to drag him down with me. I told him I was grateful for everything he had done, but I could not in good conscience allow him to continue. I told him I would find another way, that I would manage on my own, that I had survived the workhouse and I could survive this too. He listened in silence, his face unreadable. And when I finished, he took a step toward me, close enough that I could see the rise and fall of his chest, the pulse beating in his throat. He said he did not care about his reputation. He said he had spent 15 years being what society expected him to be, cold and distant and alone, and he was tired of it. He said the rumors meant nothing to him, that the opinions of people who would believe lies over truth meant nothing to him. He said the only thing that mattered was that I was safe, that I was here, that I did not leave. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I said he did not understand. I said I could not bear to be the cause of his suffering. I said I had lost everything once before, and I would not allow him to lose everything because of me. He reached out and took my hand. His grip was warm and firm, and it anchored me in a way I had not known I needed. He said I was not the cause of his suffering. He said I was the cure for it. He said that since I had come to Westerfield Manor, he had felt something he had not felt in years. He had felt alive. He had felt hope. He had felt, for the first time since his sister's death, that there was something worth fighting for. I stared at him, unable to speak. The words hung between us, heavy with meaning, trembling with possibility. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that I was more than a charity case, more than a project, more than a way to assuage his guilt over Charlotte. But I had been hurt too many times to trust easily. I had learned in the hardest possible way that hope was a dangerous thing. He seemed to sense my hesitation. He released my hand and stepped back, giving me space to breathe. His voice, when he spoke again, was gentler, more uncertain. He said he would not pressure me. He said he would not ask for anything I was not willing to give. He said that if I truly wanted to leave, he would not stop me, but he asked me to stay, not for his sake, but for my own. He asked me to trust him, just a little longer, just until the case was resolved. He asked me to give him the chance to prove that not everyone in this world would betray me. I stood there in the darkness, torn between fear and longing, between the instinct to run and the desperate wish to stay. And in the end, it was not logic that decided me. It was something far more dangerous. I looked into his eyes, and I saw the truth there. He was not lying to me. He was not manipulating me. He was offering me something real, something fragile, something that could break both of us if we were not careful. He was offering me his heart. I said I would stay. His face transformed. It was not a smile, not quite, but it was close. It was relief and gratitude and something else, something that made my pulse quicken and my breath catch. He said he was glad. And then, before I could respond, he lifted my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against my knuckles. The touch was brief, almost formal, and yet it sent a shock of warmth through my entire body. He bid me good night and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the corridor. I stood there for a long time, my hand still tingling where his lips had touched it, my mind racing with thoughts I did not dare examine too closely. I returned to my room and lay down in my bed, but sleep would not come. I stared at the canopy above me, replaying the conversation in my mind, analyzing every word, every gesture, every inflection. He had said I was the cure for his suffering. He had said I made him feel alive. He had kissed my hand as though I were a lady, not a woman he had rescued from a workhouse. What did it mean? What could it possibly mean? I told myself not to hope. I told myself that men of his station did not fall in love with women like me, regardless of what I had once been. I told myself that gratitude was not love, that protectiveness was not passion, that I was reading too much into a moment of emotional intensity. But the heart does not listen to reason, and as the first light of dawn crept through my window, I admitted to myself what I had been trying to deny. I was falling in love with the Duke of Westerfield. Against all logic, against all caution, against everything I knew about the cruelty of the world, I was falling in love with him. And I had no idea whether he could ever love me back. The days that followed were a strange kind of purgatory. The Duke and I continued our formal interactions, our polite conversations, our careful distance. But there was something different now, something charged in the air between us. I caught him looking at me when he thought I was not paying attention, his gray eyes soft with an emotion I could not name. And I found myself looking at him the same way, memorizing the lines of his face, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the rare and precious curve of his smile. We did not speak of what had passed between us that night in the corridor. We did not acknowledge the shift in our relationship, the invisible thread that now connected us. But it was there, humming beneath every word, every glance, every accidental brush of hands. And all the while, the shadow of Lady Beatrice loomed over us, a reminder that our fragile happiness could be shattered at any moment. The letter arrived on a gray morning in early spring. It was addressed to me, which was strange enough. I had received no correspondence since coming to Westerfield Manor. But when I saw the handwriting on the envelope, my blood turned to ice in my veins. It was Beatrice's hand. I opened the letter with trembling fingers and read the words that would change everything. She knew where I was. She knew about the Duke, about the investigation, about my hopes of reclaiming my inheritance, and she was offering me a choice. I could abandon my claims, sign a document renouncing any right to the Ashford estate, and disappear forever. If I did, she would leave the Duke alone. She would retract the rumors, restore his reputation, and allow him to return to his life unblemished. Or I could continue to fight. And if I did, she would destroy him. She would use every connection, every weapon, every ounce of influence she possessed to ruin him utterly. She would make certain that the name Westerfield became synonymous with scandal and disgrace. She would take from him everything he had, just as she had taken everything from me. The choice was mine. I read the letter 3 times, each word burning itself into my memory. Then I folded it carefully, placed it in the pocket of my dress, and went to find the Duke. He was in his study, as always, bent over papers that I knew related to my case. He looked up when I entered, and his face brightened with a warmth that made my heart ache. I handed him the letter without speaking. He read it in silence, his expression darkening with every line. When he finished, he set the paper down on his desk and looked at me with eyes that burned like coals. He asked me what I intended to do. I told him I did not know. I told him I could not ask him to sacrifice everything for me. I told him Beatrice was capable of carrying out her threat, that she had the power and the ruthlessness to destroy him just as she had destroyed me. He was silent for a long moment. Then he stood and walked around the desk until he was standing before me, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body. He said he did not care what Beatrice threatened. He said he would not let her win. He said he had spent his entire life being controlled by fear, by duty, by the expectations of others, and he was done. He said he would fight for me, whatever the cost. And then, before I could respond, he took my face in his hands and kissed me. It was not a gentle kiss. It was fierce and desperate, and full of everything we had both been afraid to say. I felt myself dissolving into it, all my doubts and fears melting away in the heat of his touch. I kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring years of loneliness and longing into the press of my lips against his. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his hand still cradling my face, his gray eyes blazing with an intensity that took my breath away. He said he loved me. He said he had loved me from the moment he saw me in the workhouse, when I looked up at him with those fierce green eyes and refused to be invisible. He said he had fought against it, had told himself it was impossible, had tried to convince himself it was merely pity or guilt. But it was love. It had always been love. Tears streamed down my face as I told him I loved him too. I told him I had been afraid to admit it, afraid to hope, afraid that loving him would only lead to more pain. But I could not deny it any longer. He was the first person in 4 years who had truly seen me, who had believed in me, who had fought for me when I had given up fighting for myself. We stood there for a long time, holding each other, savoring the sweetness of a moment we had both thought impossible. And when we finally drew apart, we faced the future together, united against whatever storms might come. Lady Beatrice wanted a war. She would have one. But she would not win. The weeks that followed our confession were both the happiest and the most terrifying of my life. I walked through the halls of Westerfield Manor with a lightness I had not felt since I was a girl, knowing that I was loved, truly loved, by a man who saw me for who I was. And yet the shadow of Lady Beatrice hung over every moment, a constant reminder that our happiness was borrowed, fragile, and under siege. The Duke, whom I had begun to call Edward in private moments when we were alone, threw himself into the legal battle with a ferocity I had not expected. He hired additional investigators, summoned witnesses from across the country, and spent hours each day corresponding with solicitors and barristers. He was determined to expose Beatrice's crimes, not merely to restore my inheritance, but to see her punished for what she had done. He said justice demanded nothing less. I watched him work with a mixture of admiration and fear. I admired his dedication, his refusal to be intimidated, his unwavering belief that right would prevail, but I feared what the fight was costing him. He slept little, ate less, and the shadows beneath his eyes grew darker with each passing day. When I urged him to rest, he smiled and said he would rest when it was over. When I tried to help, he gently but firmly refused, saying he did not want me drawn deeper into the ugliness than I already was. I understood his protectiveness, but it chafed at me. I had spent 4 years being powerless, watching my fate be decided by others, and I did not want to return to that helplessness now. I wanted to fight alongside him, to contribute something more than my presence. But what could I offer? I had no connections, no influence, no weapons beyond the locket that hung against my heart, and the truth that no one had believed for so long. It was Mrs. Thornton who suggested the answer. She came to me one afternoon with a box she had found in the attic, a box that had belonged to the Duke's grandmother. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written by and to various members of the aristocracy over the course of half a century. Mrs. Thornton said she had remembered something about Lady Beatrice, something from before she had married my father. She said Beatrice had not always been Lady Beatrice. She had been Miss Beatrice Crane, the daughter of a minor gentleman with gambling debts, and she had clawed her way into society through manipulation and strategic alliances. I spent the next 3 days reading those letters. Most were unremarkable, the usual gossip and pleasantries of the upper classes. But buried among them, I found something extraordinary. A letter from a woman named Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton, the wife of my father's original solicitor, written to the Duke's grandmother some 20 years before. The letter described a scandal that had been hushed up, a scandal involving a young woman named Beatrice Crane. She had been engaged to a wealthy merchant, a man twice her age, and when he died suddenly before the wedding, she had produced a will that left everything to her. The merchant's family had contested the will, claiming it was a forgery, but they had been unable to prove it. Beatrice had walked away with a fortune, and within a year she had reinvented herself as a respectable widow and begun her ascent into higher society. My hands trembled as I read the words. Here was proof that Beatrice had done this before. Here was evidence of a pattern, a history of fraud and deception that stretched back decades. And if the merchant's family had contested the will, there might still be records, witnesses, evidence that could be used against her now. I brought the letter to Edward that evening, and I watched his face transform as he read it. The exhaustion fell away, replaced by something fierce and triumphant. He said this changed everything. He said this was exactly the kind of evidence they needed to establish that Beatrice was a habitual forger, that her crimes against me were not an isolated incident, but part of a lifelong pattern of fraud. He kissed me then, right there in his study, with the letter still clutched in his hand. He said I was brilliant, that I had found the key that would unlock our victory. I laughed and told him it was Mrs. Thornton who deserved the credit. But he shook his head and said it was me, that I had refused to give up, that my persistence and courage had led us to this moment. The next morning, he dispatched investigators to find the merchant's family, to locate records of the contested will, to trace Beatrice's movements in the years before she had married my father. The hunt was on, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe we might actually win. But Beatrice was not idle. The first attack came in the form of a newspaper article, published in one of London's most widely read scandal sheets. The article claimed that the Duke of Westerfield had lost his mind, that he had taken a common beggar as his mistress, and that he was squandering his fortune on a hopeless legal case designed to satisfy her greed. It named me by my false workhouse name, Mary Brown, and suggested that I had seduced the Duke with dark arts and manipulation. I read the article in silence, my hands shaking with rage. It was lies, all lies, but they were lies dressed up in the language of concern, framed as a warning to society about the dangers of misplaced charity. The article did not need to be true to do damage. It only needed to be believed. Edward was furious. He wanted to sue the newspaper, to demand a retraction, to expose the article as the slander it was. But his solicitor counseled caution. A lawsuit would only draw more attention to the accusations, would give Beatrice exactly the spectacle she wanted. It was better, the solicitor said, to ignore the article and focus on the case. Let the courts deliver the final verdict. I agreed with the solicitor, though it cost me dearly to say so. I knew that every day the article remained unchallenged, more people would believe it. I knew that my name, whatever name I used, was being dragged through the mud. But I also knew that responding would only prolong the battle, and I wanted it over. I wanted to be free of Beatrice's shadow, once and for all. The second attack came a week later, and it was far more personal. I was walking in the garden, enjoying a rare moment of peace, when a carriage I did not recognize pulled up the drive. I watched with growing unease as a woman descended, a woman dressed in the height of fashion, with a face so beautiful it might have been painted by a master. She walked toward the house with the confidence of someone who belonged there, and I knew, before anyone told me, who she was. Lady Arabella Huntington, the woman who had nearly married Edward, the woman who had broken his heart. I retreated into the house, but I was not fast enough. She saw me through the window and smiled, a smile that did not reach her eyes. An hour later, Mrs. Thornton came to my room with a message. Lady Arabella wished to speak with me privately. She was waiting in the drawing room. Every instinct told me to refuse. I knew this was a trap, knew that Arabella had not come to make peace. But I also knew that refusing would make me look weak, would give her power over me. So I smoothed my dress, lifted my chin, and went to face her. She was even more beautiful up close, with golden hair and porcelain skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. She was everything I was not, polished and perfect and utterly at ease in the world of wealth and privilege. She looked at me as I entered, and her smile widened, though her eyes remained cold. She said she had heard so much about me. She said the whole of London was talking about the Duke's charity case, the beggar woman who had captured his attention. She said she had come to see for herself what all the fuss was about. I said nothing. I stood with my hands clasped before me, my face as composed as I could make it, and I waited. She laughed, a musical sound that grated on my nerves. She said I was not what she had expected. She had imagined someone younger, prettier, more obviously seductive. She could not understand what Edward saw in me, unless, of course, it was simply pity. Men like Edward, she said, were prone to rescuing wounded creatures. It made them feel heroic. I felt the barb sink in, but I did not let it show. I said I was sorry she had come all this way for nothing. I said the Duke was not at home and would not wish to see her regardless. I said I had nothing to say to her and suggested she leave. Her smile faltered, just for a moment. Then it returned, sharper than before. She said she had not come to see Edward. She had come to warn me. She said Beatrice was planning something that would destroy us both. She said she had heard rumors, whispers in the salons of London, that Beatrice intended to produce a witness who would testify that I had confessed to the fraud myself. A witness who would claim I had admitted in the workhouse that I had invented my story to escape poverty. I felt the blood drain from my face. It was impossible. I had never confessed to anything, because there was nothing to confess. But Beatrice was capable of producing false witnesses, of paying someone to lie under oath. She had done it before. She would do it again. Arabella watched my reaction with evident satisfaction. She said she was telling me this out of kindness, because she did not want to see Edward humiliated. She said I should do the honorable thing and disappear before I dragged him down any further. She said it was not too late to salvage his reputation, if only I had the decency to let him go. I stared at her for a long moment, seeing her clearly for the first time. She was not here out of kindness. She was here because she was jealous, because she could not bear to see Edward happy with someone else. She was Beatrice's ally, whether she knew it or not, another weapon in the arsenal being deployed against us. I told her to leave. I told her I would not be intimidated by her or by anyone. I told her that I loved Edward, and that he loved me, and that nothing she or Beatrice or anyone else said could change that. I told her to go back to London and tell her friends that I was not afraid. She rose, her face flushed with anger, and for a moment I thought she might strike me. But she merely gathered her skirts and swept toward the door. She paused at the threshold and looked back at me, her eyes glittering with malice. She said I would regret this. She said I had no idea who I was dealing with. She said Beatrice would crush me like an insect, and Edward would be left with nothing. And then she was gone. I stood in the drawing room for a long time after she left, my heart pounding, my mind racing. Her warning about the witness had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. I knew Beatrice was capable of anything, but the thought of someone standing in a courtroom and swearing that I had confessed to fraud was almost more than I could bear. Who would believe me over a sworn witness? Who would take the word of a woman from the workhouse against someone who had been coached and paid to lie? When Edward returned that evening, I told him everything. He listened in silence, his face growing darker with every word. When I finished, he pulled me into his arms and held me tightly, as though he could shield me from the world with his body alone. He said we would find this witness before Beatrice could use them. He said we would expose the lie before it could be spoken. He said he would not let her win, not now, not when we were so close to victory. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust in his strength and his resources and his love. But in the dark hours of the night, when he slept beside me and I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I could not shake the fear that we were fighting a battle we could not win. 3 days later, the investigators returned with news. They had found the merchant's family. They had found records of the contested will. And they had found something else, something none of us had expected. The merchant's nephew, a man named Thomas Crane, had been searching for Beatrice for 20 years. He had never believed his uncle's death was natural. He had spent his entire adult life gathering evidence of Beatrice's crimes, and he was willing to testify against her in court. He had documents, letters, witnesses, proof that could not be denied. But that was not all. Thomas Crane had also discovered something about my father's death, something that made the blood freeze in my veins. He had found a servant who had worked at Ashford Hall in the months before my father died. A servant who had witnessed Beatrice mixing something into my father's evening drink. A servant who had been too afraid to come forward at the time, but who was now willing to speak. My father had not died of natural causes. He had been murdered, and we finally had the proof. I wept when I heard the news, great racking sobs that shook my entire body. I wept for my father, for the death I had always suspected but never been able to prove. I wept for the years I had spent in the workhouse, knowing the truth but powerless to speak it. And I wept with relief, with vindication, with the fierce and terrible joy of knowing that Beatrice would finally face justice. Edward held me through it all, his arms strong and steady, his voice murmuring words of comfort I could barely hear. When the tears finally subsided, he cupped my face in his hands and looked into my eyes with an intensity that took my breath away. He said we had her. He said it was over. He said Beatrice would answer for everything she had done, and I would have my name, my inheritance, and my freedom back. I asked him what came next. He smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it reached his eyes. He said next came the trial, and then, if I would have him, came the rest of our lives. The trial of Lady Beatrice Ashford took place on a grey morning in late April, in a courtroom packed with spectators who had come to witness the downfall of one of society's most notorious women. I sat in the gallery beside Edward, my hand clasped tightly in his, watching as the drama of my life unfolded before the eyes of strangers. Beatrice arrived in black silk, her face composed, her bearing regal. She looked like a woman attending a funeral, which I suppose she was, the funeral of her carefully constructed lies. She did not look at me as she took her place, but I saw the tension in her shoulders, the tightness around her mouth. She knew what was coming. She had known since the moment we produced Thomas Crane and his mountain of evidence. But she was determined to play her part to the end, to maintain her innocence, even as the walls closed in around her. The prosecution laid out the case with methodical precision. They presented the forged documents, explained how the handwriting expert had identified inconsistencies, showed how the witnesses who had testified against me 4 years ago had been paid and coached. They called Thomas Crane to the stand, and he told the story of his uncle's death, of Beatrice's fraudulent will, of the decades he had spent hunting for justice. His voice was steady, his eyes fixed on Beatrice, and when he finished, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. But it was the servant's testimony that broke her. Her name was Martha, and she had been a kitchen maid at Ashford Hall in the months before my father died. She was an older woman now, gray-haired and trembling, but her voice was clear as she described what she had seen. She had witnessed Beatrice mixing a powder into my father's evening brandy. She had watched her do it not once, but many times, over the course of several weeks. She had been too afraid to speak at the time, afraid of losing her position, afraid of what Beatrice might do to her. But the guilt had haunted her for 4 years, and when Edward's investigators found her, she had wept with relief at the chance to finally tell the truth. Beatrice's composure cracked as Martha spoke. I watched the color drain from her face, watched her hands grip the railing of the dock until her knuckles turned white. Her barrister tried to discredit Martha, suggesting she was a disgruntled former servant seeking revenge, but Martha held firm. She answered every question with quiet dignity, and when she was finally dismissed, she looked at me across the courtroom and nodded, as though to say she was sorry it had taken so long. The defense had little to offer. Beatrice's barrister made arguments about circumstantial evidence and unreliable witnesses, but they rang hollow in the face of everything that had been presented. When Beatrice herself took the stand, she denied everything, her voice rising with indignation, her eyes flashing with the old fire. But the jury was unmoved. They had heard the truth, and no amount of performance could change it. The verdict came on the 3rd day, guilty on all counts, fraud, theft, and murder. Beatrice screamed when the foreman read the verdict. She screamed that it was lies, that she was innocent, that I had orchestrated the entire thing to steal what was rightfully hers. 2 bailiffs had to restrain her as the judge pronounced the sentence. She would spend the rest of her life in prison, stripped of her title, her fortune, and her freedom. I watched her being led away, and I felt something I had not expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not even relief. I felt pity. Pity for a woman who had destroyed so many lives, including her own, in pursuit of wealth and status. Pity for the emptiness that must have driven her. The hunger that could never be filled. She had taken everything from me, and in the end, she had been left with nothing. Edward squeezed my hand, and I turned to look at him. His eyes were soft with concern, as though he could sense the complicated emotions churning within me. He asked if I was all right. I told him I would be. I told him it was over. I told him I was ready to begin again. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, paperwork, and social obligations. My inheritance was restored, every penny that Beatrice had stolen returned to my name. Ashford Hall was mine again, though I could not bring myself to return there. Not yet. There were too many memories, too much pain buried in those walls. I asked Edward's solicitor to arrange for the estate to be managed from a distance, and I remained at Westerfield Manor, in the home that had become my sanctuary. Society, predictably, reversed itself with breathtaking speed. The same people who had shunned me, who had whispered about the beggar woman and the mad Duke, now clamored for invitations to our events. They sent cards and flowers and effusive letters of congratulation, as though they had believed in my innocence all along. I received them with polite detachment, accepting their well wishes without warmth. I knew what they were. I knew they would turn on me again in an instant if fortune shifted, but I no longer cared. I had learned in the workhouse and in the years since that the opinion of society meant nothing compared to the love of those who truly knew me. Edward proposed on a warm evening in May in the garden of Westerfield Manor, beneath a sky streaked with the colors of sunset. He had been nervous all day, fidgeting and distracted, and I had pretended not to notice, hiding my smile behind my teacup. When he finally led me outside and dropped to one knee, his gray eyes shining with emotion, I felt my heart swell until I thought it might burst. He said he had spent his entire life searching for something he could not name. He said he had built walls around his heart, convinced himself that he was better off alone, resigned himself to a future of duty without joy. And then I had appeared, like a ghost from another world, and everything had changed. He said I had taught him what it meant to love, truly love, without fear or reservation. He said I had given him hope when he had forgotten what hope felt like. He asked me to be his wife. I said yes before he had finished speaking. I fell to my knees beside him and threw my arms around his neck and said yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. We stayed there in the garden as the stars came out, holding each other, laughing and crying, and making promises we intended to keep for the rest of our lives. The wedding took place in the chapel at Westerfield Manor, a small and intimate ceremony attended only by those who had stood by us through the darkest times. Mrs. Thornton wept openly as I walked down the aisle. Thomas Crane, who had become something like a friend in the month since the trial, gave me away in my father's absence. And Edward waited for me at the altar, his eyes never leaving mine, his face alight with a joy I had never seen him wear before. I wore my mother's locket over my wedding gown, the same locket that had saved my life, that had led Edward to recognize me, that had been my only companion through 4 years of darkness. When the vicar asked for rings, Edward surprised me by producing not only the wedding band, but a small velvet box. Inside was a ring set with emeralds, the same deep green as my eyes, surrounded by diamonds that caught the candlelight and scattered it into rainbows. He said it had belonged to his grandmother. He said she would have loved me. He said he wanted me to wear it as a symbol of the family I was joining, the family that would love me and protect me for all the years to come. I wept as he slipped it onto my finger. I wept through the vows, through the prayers, through the moment when the vicar pronounced us husband and wife. And when Edward kissed me, sealing our union before God and the small assembly of witnesses, I felt something I had thought lost forever. I felt whole. That night, as we sat together in the drawing room of our home, watching the fire burn low in the grate, I told Edward about my mother. I told him about the letter she had written me on the day I was born, the letter I had carried with me through every trial and tribulation. I had never shown it to anyone, had kept it close to my heart like a sacred relic. But now I wanted to share it with him, to give him the piece of myself I had protected for so long. I retrieved the letter from my vanity box and placed it in his hands. The paper was worn soft from years of handling, the ink faded but still legible. He read it slowly, his face tender, his eyes glistening in the firelight. When he finished, he looked at me and said, "My mother had been right." He said I was a light in the darkness, a gift to everyone who knew me. He said he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the love she had poured into that letter, and the love I had shown him since the moment we met. I took the letter back and folded it carefully, tucking it once more into its hiding place against my heart. But for the first time, it did not feel like a burden. It felt like a blessing, a reminder of where I had come from and how far I had traveled, a talisman of hope that had carried me through the impossible and delivered me here, to this moment, to this man, to this life I had never dared to imagine. The years that followed were kinder than any I had known. Edward and I divided our time between Westerfield Manor and a townhouse in London, navigating the social season with patience and grace. I learned to hold my head high among the aristocracy, to accept their compliments without cynicism, to forgive their fickleness, even if I could not forget it. I became known as the Duchess who had risen from the ashes, a symbol of resilience and redemption that inspired whispers wherever I went. But the gossip did not touch me. I had found something more precious than reputation, more valuable than wealth, more enduring than the approval of strangers. I had found love. Not the love of fairy tales, perfect and uncomplicated, but the love of real life, messy and difficult and infinitely worth the struggle. Edward and I fought sometimes, disagreed often, challenged each other constantly. But we also laughed and dreamed and grew together, building a partnership that deepened with every passing year. I eventually returned to Ashford Hall on a golden afternoon in autumn when the leaves were falling like whispered secrets. Edward came with me, holding my hand as we walked through the rooms where I had spent my childhood. The house had been neglected under Beatrice's management, but I had hired workers to restore it, to bring back the beauty I remembered. And as I stood in the garden, where my mother had taught me the names of flowers, I felt her presence beside me, warm and gentle and proud. I planted roses that day, in the spot where she used to sit and read to me. Red roses for love, white roses for remembrance, yellow roses for the joy she had brought into my life and the joy I had finally found again. Edward watched me work, his gray eyes soft with understanding. When I finished, he put his arm around me and we stood together in silence, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. He asked me if I was happy. I told him I was. I told him I had spent so many years believing happiness was something that happened to other people, something I had forfeited along with my name and my fortune. But I had been wrong. Happiness was not a destination. It was a choice to hope when hope seemed foolish, to love when love seemed dangerous, to believe in the possibility of redemption even when the world insisted it was impossible. He kissed me then, in the garden of my childhood home, with my mother's roses blooming at our feet and the evening star appearing in the darkening sky. And I knew, with a certainty that transcended reason, that I had come home at last. I still wear my mother's locket every day. It hangs against my heart as it always has, a reminder of who I was and who I have become. Sometimes when the light catches it just right, I imagine I can see her face in the gleam of the gold, smiling at me with the love that death cannot diminish. I was Eleanor Ashford. I was a beggar in a workhouse, a woman without a name, a ghost haunting the margins of a world that had forgotten me. And then I was found, not by chance, but by grace. Not by luck, but by love. The Duke saw a locket beneath my rags, but he found something more valuable than diamonds or gold. He found me, and in finding me, he gave me back myself. This is my story, a story of loss and redemption, of darkness and light, of a love that defied every obstacle the world could throw against it. It is not a fairy tale. It is better. It is true. And it is only the beginning.